even members of the Chinese diaspora, who are miles away from China, are still afraid of China's ability to track their conversations. So you know, even outside of China, people will not talk about Chinese politics. And I actually remember I was at well, it's kind of a spicy thing, but I was at a Tiananmen commemoration, which of course is not Chinese state's favorite thing. But, you know, you had people from China and they were wearing masks. This was way back in 2010 or something. So people in China, I think, have always been pretty sensitive to this idea that the government will and has the ability to be able to track your movement and has the ability to arrest you for what you're doing online, which the Chinese government has done multiple times. So I think these two combined, like that kind of experience, and then, you know, this economic thing that I was thinking really drove me towards realizing Bitcoin could have value.
Hello guys, welcome once again to BitCorner podcast. Today is the first time that you're gonna see me with glasses, but I always use glasses, but I normally use it during the night. But I'm okay. I'm not getting blind. I just have a lot of allergies. It's a springtime here, so anyways, welcome once again to BitCorner podcast. Today we're gonna have a really interesting episode. I think we need to learn a lot about this. There's, you know, Bitcoin is a rabbit hole, but we need to learn a lot from the world. And lately, I have been reading a lot of Bitcoin books. There are some great books that have been published recently. One is Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? The other one, of course, is The Big Print. That's awesome. The other one is Broken Money. So I don't know. There's a lot of authors out there. But today we're gonna talk with one of the authors. I think one of the coolest books out there right now, and you should check it out. That is Would Mao Hold Bitcoin. So, anyways, I just want to welcome Roger Huang to our podcast. So, welcome.
Yeah, Juan, thank you so much for having me on. Super appreciate the invite, and seeing some of your episodes that I was telling you, and I think looking forward to a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, this will be an amazing episode. I have a list of things that I want to talk to you because I have seen that you have covered a lot of things. I have seen a little bit about your background, and I think we have something similar. But anyways, I'll let you know when is the time. But before that, if you can share a little bit about your background, so people that don't know who you are, if you can tell a little bit about that, and then we will go deeper into the Bitcoin rabbit hole journey.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I was born in China, and then I would go back and forth between Canada and China in my youth. Right. And I grew up in Montreal. And Montreal is actually a low-key kind of like Bitcoin hub. I mean, that's where the Canadian Bitcoin conference is hosted these days, but that was also one of the places where there was a Bitcoin embassy. So there's a physical space for Bitcoin way before, even there were all these different spaces now. There's a lot of great spaces now, but Montreal had one of the kind of OG ones, the Bitcoin embassy. And also one of the co-founders of Blockstream was in Montreal at the time. So the team actually spent some time in Montreal. And so, around that culture, I got really, really curious about Bitcoin. And I started writing about it in 2014. And really it was a way for me to try to figure out a little bit more just like, hey, like what's going on with this, right? Like, to me, I write about things that I try to understand. And that started this engagement of like going down the rabbit hole, as you described, and really talking through Bitcoin. It's gone to other topics too, like Nostr and just encryption and privacy just in general. But, even with Bitcoin itself, you got a lot of ground to cover. I guess like one thing that might be helpful for your audience to know as well in context is I actually graduated from McGill in economics with a bachelor's. And that was the time during the Great Recession during 2008, 2009. Or it was like right after, basically. It was like when the when the economics profession per se was like, it's kind of like crisis mode, because it was like basically I graduated in 2013, which I guess tells everyone my age, but whatever.
You're a millennial, just like me, so don't worry.
Yeah. Or I'm like one of those super smart people that finished university at like 2 or something. But no, I'm not one of those people. Yeah, so that was like when the field was in crisis. I mean, I still think the field is in crisis to this day, but it was a really interesting kind of time to have these different discussions about economics and really understanding, I think, also just the mechanism of how economics works to like screw the average person. Like, if you disguised in all the technical terms and all the couch work, there's a lot of like cautionary lessons and a lot of things and complexity that really lead to people getting hurt by unintended consequences. And sometimes even intended consequences, frankly, because some of the goals of policy are not necessarily to, improve everybody's lot in life. You can't. There's always trade-offs, basically.
Yeah.
In economics and in anything else. So yeah, that's also informed kind of my curiosity into Bitcoin and sort of the way I approach it as well. I self-taught myself to code, so I kind of feel like I've leveled through like many of the different rabbit holes of Bitcoin. Still, there are many more to go, but those were kind of like my initial steps into some of the big ones, right? Like the economic side, the monetary economics, as well as the monetary history, and the technology side. And I really like to think I bridge both. And I'm looking to always research and get deeper into those both, and then to get deeper into topics like China and Bitcoin.
You were also writing for TechCrunch in the past, right? I don't know if you still do it.
Yeah, I mean, I used to write for, it's kind of like a funny story, but I used to write for a bunch of like the conventional tech outlets, like Fast Company, TechCrunch. Like, I've got bylines like kind of all over the place. Yeah, they haven't, it's not necessarily because, well, to be fair, I haven't really pitched them a lot, but it's been very difficult now that I've written consistently about Bitcoin for like a while now, with Forbes and like with other places. Sometimes I've also been published in Bitcoin Mag and a couple of other places as well. It's a little bit more difficult, I find, to pitch stories related to Bitcoin to the editors I used to work with. So I'll just put it that way. But yes, I did used to write for TechCrunch. I did like 2 articles. It was never like super consistent. But yeah, I used to write for VentureBeat as well. Probably my most consistent writing has been at Forbes. And then for people who have really been following my career, by the way, like I got my start at this like really small blog outlet called Tech Vibes, which is kind of like the Canadian tech coverage, like the Canadian TechCrunch. And so I did my most consistent writing there because they paid me like well, it was like a pretty good amount for at the time, but it was like per article. And, I was actually using it to like make money at the time. So I wrote a ton of bylines with them, but I don't even know if they're still around. Like the old editor is, we still catch up every once in a while. You always fondly remember the first editor who kind of took a chance on you. And Tech Vibes was kind of like my first outlet. And then TechCrunch was the first big outlet that took a chance on my writing.
Yeah, I noticed that because I was doing a bit of research about you, and I saw that
researched me. That's not good. That's like a lot of
and TechCrunch is one of the. I mean, it's cool. I like to read them, also The Verge and other ones, but it's cool. And that's why I was telling you at the beginning that we kind of started the same way, because before making the podcast, I'm not a journalist or a writer. I'm an engineer, but when COVID started, I lost my job because there was a lot, lockdowns and everything. So I started to publish on Medium, and I found this editor that it's small, one of the biggest in Medium, but small when you compare to all of these ones. And I have made Apple reviews, and I still do it from time to time, and I collaborate with some guys here in Spain. But yeah, it's cool to see that. How your career have evolved because right now you even have a book, so it's super awesome. It's really good to find that when you have similar careers, then you pivot into Bitcoin, and then you cannot leave Bitcoin at all because you're so trapped in this deeper rabbit hole, right?
Yeah. Well, you bring your skills to Bitcoin, which I think is
Exactly.
a really cool thing.
Yeah. And when do you find the value of Bitcoin? That which is another way to say your aha moment, right? But I'm thinking just in the deeper level, not the monetary value. I mean, right? What hit you to be in this space?
Well, the first thing I should say about that, and I always try to make a point of saying this, is people assume that I'm like super rich or something because I'm like been writing about it for a long time, but I'm super not. And I should emphasize this to all your viewers and potential attackers and fishers that like I just don't like. I've always been like, even when I first met Bitcoin, I was like a super poor student. I was like one of these like bankers or like Michael Saylor or someone who has like billions of dollars or whatever. Although I guess few people are like that anyways. But so I always approached it with like intellectual curiosity first. Also got involved with the community to a certain extent. Of course, like, trying to build out certain things related to it. Like now, for example, I consult for and I work for a Bitcoin only company, which is Block Rewards, which we talked about a little bit before. Which does Bitcoin payroll. Shout out to Blockwords. I think that when I first really appreciated the value of Bitcoin, so I'd always kind of loosely struggled with it, just always all the time. I always had something in my head that was like kind of leading me down that route. I mean, there was kind of two things. One was I had just kind of like I described to you in university. I just got the sense that like the average person didn't understand. Like to me, what was really kind of infuriating a little bit was that I was seeing pretty smart people, but they were using all these like technical terms and they were using their knowledge to really like enrich, the rich, basically make the rich get richer or get poorer. Yeah. And it was kind of disguised in this very like, oh, we're saving the economy from like the Great Depression and all this other stuff. But if you look through, the literature and everything, you start to see. I mean, I don't want to get into like a full-bodied like economics discussion. Yeah. But even as the 1970s is like the an example. It's the example that strikes the American kind of context the most. I want to point out that throughout history, especially in China, and I covered that in my book, like there have been so many instances of the government losing control of paper money and just paper money supply, and that leads to disastrous consequences. So we have all this in the economic literature, and still, nevertheless, economists persist. And namely what they do is like whenever there's like a minor problem, or like a recession or anything, they try to pump money into the system. This is the whole, I mean, you're going to have Larry on the show, so this is the whole premise of the big print and also just printing money to solve all of our problems. But actually printing money, as an economist, like, creating facilities and doing open market operations. Yeah. Disguising in all these terms, it doesn't actually help people in the medium to long term. It actually dramatically harms people, right? It brings inflation as a consequence, a long-term consequence. And even in the short term, it disguises itself in all these fancy words. And that's one of the things that I think Bitcoiners are really good at, is describing getting to the core of kind of, for example, the Cantillon effect. Like, why does that matter to the average person? And the Cantillon effect is this like very fancy scholarly term, but when you break it down, what it really means is that the closer you are to power, the more you benefit. And for many reasons, this rankles a lot of people, right? And so I saw the direct consequences of all this. So I remember studying economics, and then people were saying that LIBOR was being rigged, the London Interbank Offer Rate, which for your listeners is one of the most important privately set market rates. It's basically a reference rate. So your mortgage or anything else kind of depends on the level of this rate, which is basically a rate that a set of London banks offer each other. And that was being manipulated by the banks themselves, right? And so it's like, well, you have the system that is creating these dramatic consequences, and you have a system of essentially fraud. or I perceived it to be fraud. So that was like the first thing that really drove me, I think, was rattling my head towards Bitcoin, right? I'm like, well, could this be an alternative, right? Could this be an alternative to a world where people manipulate the money supply and people manipulate kind of economics? And then the second thing that kind of really drove me is where I saw the value is I've always been pretty cypherpunky in my leanings. I this actually came before Bitcoin, and really my interest in Bitcoin. I think part of the reason why is because of my experience kind of doing this hybrid of like going to China and then going to Canada and you know what happens when you do that. So I never worked for a Chinese company, but I have worked for American and US and Canadian companies like remotely in China. So you get like a pretty good appreciation for like a semi-hostile kind of, you kind of assume everything is surveilled, and you can see like really active signs of this. You know, like, yeah, well, I mean, just the most obvious is like when you're in China, right? You need to use a VPN, otherwise you can't access basically anything, right? The VPN is really slow, so that's usually the most obvious one. But you know, there's like all these different elements of it, right? You can hear about people who the telecom system is very monitored in China. So you hear about people who get called by someone to say like, hey, you've been calling too many overseas numbers. You know, so it's very clear to me, and it felt clear to me that it's a surveillance society. And one of the things that actually stood out to me was how afraid, and this is like a very sad fact, but how afraid even members of the Chinese diaspora, who are miles away from China, are still afraid of China's ability to track their conversations. So you know, even outside of China, people will not talk about Chinese politics. And I actually remember I was at well, it's kind of a spicy thing, but I was at a Tiananmen commemoration, which of course is not Chinese state's favorite thing. But you know, you had people from China and they were wearing masks. This was way back in like, you know, 2010 or something. So people in China, I think, have always been pretty sensitive to this idea that the government will and has the ability to be able to track your movement and has the ability to arrest you for what you're doing online, which the Chinese government has done multiple times. So I think these two combined, like that kind of experience, and then, you know, this economic thing that I was thinking really drove me towards realizing Bitcoin could have value. And then, you know, it really cemented itself with the book. I mean, that was kind of part of the reason why I wrote the book in the first place, is I was trying to figure out, like, is Bitcoin fitting into this rubric, right? Like, is that creating value for billions of people, including Chinese people? And, you know, throughout the book, I was forced to conclude yes. And this was coming from, like, I wasn't necessarily, I mean, obviously I'm someone who is a Bitcoiner, but I was trying really hard to find, but I was just trying really hard to report the facts as they were. So like one of the things my book covers, for example, is that Tether seems to be more popular than Bitcoin in China. This seems to be just everyone I've ever talked to, you know, like all the different sources, like even like if you go to the merchants that sell both Bitcoin and Tether, you'll see that there's many more Tether merchants than Bitcoin merchants. Now, this is not something that I love as a Bitcoin. And in fact, I've said some pretty strong things about how Tether is, in my opinion, a proto-CBDC, right? Mm-hmm. So, a proto-central bank digital currency. You know, this kind of led me down that rabbit hole, and it made me realize, even though that, you know, these facts were coming out, that still a lot of Chinese people were still buying Bitcoin and still using Bitcoin. So I was just talking with Ella Hoff, who they did like a survey. They did more like that's kind of missing. So what I do is kind of like more like qualitative in the sense of like I've interviewed people who are in the Chinese Bitcoin scene, right? But they tend to be like the big nodes, let's say, like people who have run exchanges or things like that, right? So they have their own perspective. You know, there are people like Chain Analysis that analyze how much volume of trading volume is coming in for Bitcoin, and it's continually increasing. right? Since 2021.
Yeah.
But the thing that's kind of missing in China, or with the Chinese context, because it's, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more, but Bitcoin's basically restricted in China, is kind of like a more like the average person, like, 20, 30 people, that kind of a panel. And Ella actually just did it, and she told me that, Chinese users of Bitcoin seem to use it the most out of all people. In the sense of, apparently, like, they were the highest percentage to answer that they'd used their Bitcoin, if they did own Bitcoin, that they used their Bitcoin in the last week or 2 weeks. Yes. Yeah, the Bitcoin I don't know what to call, but it's her and Sarah Krebs.
Yeah. She reacted to me about that. Okay, that's it. That's really interesting. That
So I am seeing, like, not even, it's not just my lens. It's just like it is creating value, and so the book actually cemented that even more. And I've also found a lot of community in what we're doing. I mean, one other thing is, like, before, the book has helped a lot actually with me with framing this up, because honestly, like, before, I have found a little bit of community. Now, I will say, I have a weird relationship somewhat with the Bitcoin community in the sense that I was never really part of, like, the whole, I was on Clubhouse, and I was part of the Clubhouse Bitcoin and all this other stuff. But I spent a lot of my life just writing about Bitcoin behind a screen and not actually going to any physical Bitcoin events. So between, I would say, 2014 and 2023, that was like, 2022, that was close to my life. And then I started going to more bit devs. I was just more interested in that kind of a vibe. And then really over the last year, I've, because of the book and trying to get out there with the book tour, I've started going to more events, including adopting Bitcoin in San Salvador, and other places, right? And that's allowed me to, like, really get an appreciation and like meet people like you and other Bitcoiners, and I think that's been really good in terms of value.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna discuss also about China and the banning, because I think that's one of the main topics. But I want to ask you. I have two questions, but okay, I don't know which one to ask you first, because I have a mixed one. But the first one is just out of curiosity, because there's a lot of misconceptions. I think most in Western, because I just said China stays. There's a lot of surveillance, so every information that comes out there, I think, to the Western is very manipulated, right? So first, I want to ask you, like, what the Western in general audience often get completely wrong about, China relationship between technology and probably money?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing that Western
even
people...
power, I think.
Huh?
No, even power. I think we can put it there in the same box, like tech,
there's a
money,
lot
power.
of different. There's a lot of different elements there. I think one thing that, and I've seen this even with Western people who study China, and I think the thing with my perspective is I never was like a formal academic or someone who's like, like, I mean, I read as much as you can read about these things, but I also have spent not a crazy amount of time as well. Some people have definitely spent more time in country than I have, right? But going back and forth, unfortunately, I think one of the things is that, like, people think, well, I don't know why they think this, but they think I'm Chinese, right? So, so I do get really, because I kind of have this thing where I don't really talk or comment. I think part of it is just some of the training from being not necessarily a journalist, but, like, let's just say a writer or a contributor. Like, when you interview a lot of people, what you get used to doing, and unfortunately I ruin it all by coming onto podcasts like this, and I speak like 99.5% of the time. But actually, what I found really interesting is sometimes I just don't say anything, and I just let people kind of, like, talk through it. I just ask them, like, one question at a time, and the kind of thing, and just kind of like active listening. You'd be just surprised how far active listening can take you. But of course,
absolutely.
So you might you might know that. But what that's done is the combination of, like, being Chinese enough and speaking Mandarin and everything like that. Like, you get a lot of insight into, and this is especially the case on Clubhouse, actually. really, which was kind of interesting. Because I tended to go and look for these like Mandarin language conversations. And for people who, so let's just go with like base layers. Like I'm assuming that most of your viewers, and when you're assuming for the Western, they may not even study China at all. They may not even know anything about China. Then there's people who, you know, study China. They don't really speak Mandarin. There's people who speak Mandarin, study China, they live in the country and stuff like that, but they're not treated as Chinese, right? And then there's a few people who are, you know, I would put myself somewhere in between there. I think all tiers to a certain extent, but especially the bottom tier, have a really misguided view. And it gets better the more you actually interact with Chinese people. But the one really misguided view is that like Chinese people are just like defeated and stilted and like NPCs or something that are just like subjected to control and like they don't have agency and they don't play a role. And I just think that the world economy in many ways is shaped by Chinese people breaking rules. Like that's what most people don't realize. Like China has the most capital controls in the world. And what that means is that Chinese people are restricted on taking money out of the Chinese system. So there's a 50,000 USD a person a year limit for Chinese citizens. Basically, if you're above that, you need to usually talk to your bank and you need to submit like a notice that's approved by the state regulator, SAFE.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's difficult to get money out of the country at scale. But you know, this is why there's so much tourism and there's like misreported travel vouchers. And then people are always talking about the real estate market and things like that. And this is why these things happen. It's because of these restrictions. And likewise, the Chinese internet is not stilted. Like, I mean, there's a lot of like sarcasm, irony, like, you know, I think people assume like, oh yeah, like China, like they're all like brainwashed and none of them know about Tiananmen. And, I would say that that's not, like that would be like a fundamental misconception that the Chinese people are like passively taking this in. Why I say that and why I think it's really important to say that is because sometimes when I talk about the things I talk about, like the digital yuan or the fact that there is one surveillance camera for every 2 Chinese people, right? Like,
wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. Really, really dystopian stuff. If you've ever been if you or any of your viewers ever go to Tiananmen Square, it's like wild how many cameras there are. So they're just like mounted on a pod. And anyways, China has the number 1 most cameras. But you know what country is number 2? Or, I don't know if you would be able to guess.
I don't know, United Kingdom maybe.
Yeah, it is actually the United Kingdom. So
you see, right. I heard about a little bit about that, but I don't know.
So the United Kingdom is second, right? But see, the thing is, when I talk about China, most people think like, oh, it can't happen to us. Like China is its own different thing. It's like so dystopian, et cetera, et cetera. So, no, I actually don't think that's the case. Like there are more dramatic consequences sometimes for your online activity. You know, we have to be really careful with saying that the Chinese people are like particularly zombie-like or NPC-like or whatever. Like, no, they also have a lot of agency. They've also faced a lot of like restrictions and stifling from the government. And a lot of what the Chinese government is doing are models that a lot of other governments are trying to copy. Because it's not like they're not trying to like win at the World Communist Awards or whatever it is, but it's just a function of like the more states just crave control, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, that's kind of like they tend to centralize towards that. I mean, it's kind of like an entropy thing. Like in the long term, it drifts in that direction. Obviously there's like divots and it never doesn't quite go exactly where you are, exactly how you think it will. But, you know, in China, that would be one thing. So that would be one misconception. And there's like so many examples of this, like videos of like old Chinese men telling the police to go fuck themselves and all this other stuff. And like, you know, it's like, I think in general, the Chinese people, and having been in the Chinese internet for a while too, like they're quite a rebel spirit. you just wouldn't expect that if you didn't know anything about China, like from the outside, right? And I think the more and more you talk with people in China, the more and more you realize like the cracks between everything. And yes, China does have a surveillance state, and yes, there are a lot of restriction measures, but also Chinese people are very used to getting around a lot of these things, and in a way that could, because a lot of this is either here already and you just don't realize it, or it might be coming to you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that I want to ask you, and because I think it's one of the most, how I can say, I don't know if impactful is the right word, but things that you have covered is the Hong Kong protests, right? So I don't know if you can walk us through the story, because I don't know how many people know about that. Like, for example, what sparked the protest, like what actually happened on the ground, right? And I think because I think there's a lot of lessons there that are really important, and I think now more than before. And I think that Bitcoin, it's I don't know, but I feel like it was like a huge role there, or it can be, and also I don't know, protocols like Nostr, that it's an alternative way to not be banned, right? So you can share it a little bit about that. Cuando dejas tus activos digitales en un exchange o en custodia de alguien más, te expones a riesgos de terceros no deseados. A diferencia del sistema bancario tradicional, Bitcoin te permite tomar el control total de tus fondos utilizando tus propias claves privadas. Esto te permite ser soberano y esencialmente tu propio banco. Al tomar el control de tus Bitcoin, puedes evitar riesgos innecesarios de terceros. Almacenar tus Bitcoin en custodia de terceros como los exchanges puede exponerte a ataques de actores malintencionados, gobiernos o estafadores que lo único que quieren es apoderarse de tu dinero. Las billeteras de hardware aumentan la seguridad de tu billetera porque tus claves privadas se almacenan en un dispositivo especializado que no está siempre conectado al Internet. Como te he dicho antes, mantener tus claves almacenadas en un dispositivo en línea puede exponerte a factores adicionales de ataque, por lo que se recomienda usar una billetera de hardware al almacenar grandes cantidades de Bitcoin durante largos periodos de tiempo. Jade es una billetera de hardware no custodial para Bitcoins y Liquid que ofrece opciones de firma simple y firmas múltiples. Yo personalmente lo utilizo para almacenar mis Bitcoins, ya que me siento mucho más seguro manteniendo mis Bitcoins en una billetera fría que en una almacenada, por ejemplo, en mi teléfono. Si estás pensando en adquirir uno para ti, no olvides utilizar el código de descuento de nuestro show, BitCorner Podcast. De esta forma estarás apoyando directamente el show y además obtendrás un 10% de descuento para la compra de tu billetera fría.
Yeah, no, I spent quite a bit of time, including being in Hong Kong. As I was kind of explaining to you before that we started recording, like I was actually in Hong Kong, during both protests, although like towards the end. So, for example, the 2004. So let's start off by talking a little bit about what the protests were and what they were about. And so there were actually two protests in Hong Kong that have happened. 2014 was the Umbrella Revolution. People might remember, a bunch of Hong Kongers with umbrellas. And then 2019 was the anti kind of extradition law protests. And in both cases, so going all the way back a little bit, since Hong Kong was handed over to China in 1997, they have had a system which is called one country, two systems. And the inherent contradiction was that Hong Kong, under the British, had a democratic system of sorts, right? Now, basically, the people could elect a chief executive, and they could elect the legislative council, which is kind of their equivalent of a parliament. And so when Hong Kong basically was handed over from the British to mainland China, there was a compromise reached, because obviously China right now is a one-party, well, there's a nuance in there, but let's just, for purpose and sake, say a one-party state.
Right.
And not a state where you can vote for your leader, or at least not your paramount leader. You know, so the way the authorities kind of arranged it was that Hong Kong would have like this 50-year transition period. And the idea was, during that period, Hong Kong would still have the ability, there would still be the ability to have elections. There would still be freedom of the press. You know, you would be allowed to do things that you would not normally be allowed to do in mainland China. One of the most famous examples is that in Hong Kong, you used to have the ability to do physical commemorations at Tiananmen Square. And they were, I think, by far the largest in, you would say, like a Mandarin-speaking region of sorts, right? So this start with there. And Hong Kong has its own constitution called the Basic Law, which is separate from mainland China. And that actually plays a role in how Hong Kong interfaces with Bitcoin, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But suffice it to say, Hong Kong and China, one country, two systems, they're still part of the same country, but they're run differently. Now, in both 2014 and 2019, there were sparks, and those sparks were caused by the central government, which is the mainland Chinese, you know, Xi Jinping and everything. People think about that. Kind of intervening more into the affairs of Hong Kong. And generally speaking, there have been like two flashpoints. One was that China tried to insert into Hong Kong what they called a patriotic education system. Since the Tiananmen protests in mainland China, they've revamped the curriculum so that, you know, it stresses patriotism. And honestly, I think this has like worked to a certain degree, because most young people in China seem to be very nationalistic. That's just a quick read from the sentiment I've had. But they tried to implement the same thing in Hong Kong, and that led to protests. And China then also tried to sign an extradition law with Hong Kong. Didn't have an extradition treaty with Hong Kong in the books. Of course, there have been people kidnapped from Hong Kong into mainland China, but that's like a different story. So in both instances, this was kind of like the central Chinese government trying to impose more restrictions on the Hong Kong government. Throughout it all, I think one of the things that united Hong Kong people, many Hong Kong people, protesting in the streets, sometimes in the millions, I think, is that in this transition period, China had promised universal suffrage, meaning the ability for everybody to choose their own leader. Now, that, according to the protesters, and in my opinion too, actually, was never fully granted to the people of Hong Kong. And it was in a way where China there were elections, but it was heavily rigged. So for example, there were like some really weird quirks. Just to give you the two most obvious examples. One is that the chief executive, the nominees are chosen by basically the central government. So you have the ability to vote for your chief executive, but the chief executive has to be approved by the central government, right? So that's an example. The second is that the Legislative Council was actually elected through a combination of people's votes and then what were called like functional constituencies. And the functional constituencies were kind of like these experts, and those could be like manipulated, and they were always like pretty pro-China. So it was like really hard so in Hong Kong, there were kind of like, broadly speaking, there were, let's just say, a pan China leaning coalition and a pan not China leaning coalition. Let's just broadly say that. And the pan non China coalition usually had a really difficult time winning anything because the system was kind of stacked against them, right? Like they had not only to get votes from people, but they also had to get votes from these groups of like experts that were like more or less pro-China, right? Many of those groups were. So, the Hong Kong people, I think, felt cheated about this. And so even though there's those two sparks I talked about, like the education part, as well as, the part of the extradition law, this constant theme of grievance at not being accorded universal suffrage, not being given what they were promised, I think really lit a fire and continued the Hong Kong protests, where we saw millions march in the streets. Unfortunately, now, I do think that basically China, in response, initiated a national security law that they kind of put through Hong Kong's process. And they arrested people who were running for the pan non-China leaning side. And a lot of those parties, some of the oldest parties in Hong Kong, the Democratic Party and the Civic Party, have now disbanded because the threat from the authorities is too much. Before in Hong Kong, there was freedom of the press. There was Apple Daily, for example, which ran a lot of critiques of the Chinese Communist Party. But the owner of Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai, is now in prison. And that's been a constant kind of theme. And not even just Apple Daily. There have been independent news outlets that were shut down by police. And they would send like 50, 60 police officers. And so things have been quiet. And one of the reasons why, and I think this is a learning lesson, I think people should take this as a lesson, is they use COVID, honestly, as a convenient political way to, basically the cops would come in and say, well, there's COVID now, so you guys can't have like assembly and stuff like that. So they would shut down public rallies and things like that. So I think that's a cautionary tale. Don't think that just because this is China and Hong Kong, this can't happen to you. It already has happened to you, probably, if you live in a country like Canada or in the States. But, exactly. More and more...
The Canadian strike, right?
Yeah, exactly. You will see this level of, state of emergency and everything like that related to enforcing the state power. So, let's talk a little bit more about the role of Bitcoin in all of this, which I think is quite interesting, actually. When I was there in both instances, I wasn't there when the protest was actively happening for, it was just timing reasons, I think. In 2014, I was actually there. It was kind of interesting. I was walking through the encampment site, and then they still left all their stickers and stuff, but they had left a few days before, actually. So I was always a little bit too late. Yeah, I was a really weird tourist in Hong Kong. So the first thing is I would go to Hong Kong because it's super annoying to work in mainland, because you need a VPN, right? So if you're working for a foreign, and the foreign company's entire infrastructure is on Google or Microsoft, it's just impossible to work, especially Google at the time. It was impossible to work. So I would go to Hong Kong, and I would always be the weird one that would go up to all these different things. And to give you an example, I remember Snowden. I went to the Mira Hotel, and I was like, "Can I go see the room that Snowden stayed in?" And then they were like, "Who the hell are you? What's wrong with you?" But this is I also came to Hong Kong I think it was a week or 2 weeks after Snowden got jumped out into Hong Kong, into Russia. But yeah, if people forget, he was in Hong Kong for a little bit of time, at the hotel, which is where he actually told the world about the beginnings of kind of those revelations. So anyways, that was kind of my context, but I spent a lot of time kind of trying to dig around and see, would Bitcoin play a role or not? And the answers I got, just kind of talking with you again, I'm not trying to inject a narrative. I think at the beginning, I've gotten a little bit wiser. I think at the beginning of my journey with this, I was a little bit let me go find the instances of Bitcoin, supporting. But you realize that some of this stuff is a lot more subtle. So I wrote an article, for example, about how Bitcoin's price might have increased in Hong Kong during the protests. I talked with some of the ATM operators, and I had this thesis that yeah, maybe more people are using Bitcoin as like a way to like stand up to the man. But then they were like, the ATM operators were like, no, like everybody's protesting. Like no one has access like to all ATMs. Like our volume's at an all-time low. Actually.
Really? Okay, that's interesting. That's true.
So yeah, but I saw these signs, and there were little things. Like, so for example, Genesis Block, which was kind of like this big OTC desk. They were really big in the FTX space as well. They like raised some money using Bitcoin Cash, and they handed out water bottles to protesters. So I wrote about that. That was like one thing. But what was more interesting to me was like why Hong Kongers weren't using Bitcoin as much as they were. Because as it was the case, I mean, I know some instances of like, for example, some Hong Kong groups that are now learning more about Bitcoin and training more about Bitcoin. But it was really interesting to me because a lot of the things that happened in Hong Kong were kind of like the Bitcoiners' dystopian situation, right? So they were freezing people's bank accounts, not for any criminal activity, but just literally because you were politically involved or they thought you were protesting or something, right? Like they did that to a few people. The Hong Kong police were actually tracking people through the use of digital surveillance. Like they were using your location from octopus cards, which is kind of like the public transit cards. And so the protesters started using cash because they realized that they were being tracked through the subway station by the police. And then the police actually at various points came into different like stations and they were like beating random people. Like this is very famous like kind of videos out there of like them getting onto the metro stations and doing that. And then the other thing was I was picking up a lot of chatter where people were like, they kind of understood the dynamics of it. And there were a lot of people who were advocating to leave the Hong Kong dollar. So the Hong Kong dollar is sort of similar to the Chinese yuan. It's kind of like, it's set up by a trading board. Hong Kong has its own fascinating monetary arrangement, by the way. I highly encourage all of your readers to like read into it more. I obviously geeked out a lot more about it because it was part of my economic studies. But the short of it is that Hong Kong has its own currency called the Hong Kong dollar, which trades at certain conditions. Anyways, people were looking to go away from the Hong Kong dollar. So you would think like, oh, well, people are so aware there's digital surveillance and people are looking to like say F you to the government by getting away from their currency. So this is a perfect insertion of Bitcoin. But in Hong Kong actually, and I think this is what you're going to see play out in the world, people have a more intuitive attachment to the US dollar. Especially people in Hong Kong. A lot of the protesters were pretty pro-US because it gets very binary, right? Because if it's like, well, China's oppressing us, well, then we need the US for help a little bit. And you might do the opposite, right? Like a lot of countries are like, well, the US is oppressing us, so now we need China. So it's like, it tends to be very binary. And so, instead of people saying like, oh, we should take our money and put it into Bitcoin. I mean, some people might have done that. And I saw some small price fluctuations in Bitcoin and things like that. But it wasn't like a mass usage kind of thing, right? Most people from the reporting that I got seem to have instead converted that into US dollars. And this is a thing that is, I think, the next frontier. So I think even now with the United States saying like CBDCs are dead and all this other stuff, like the real conflict is going to be between stablecoins and Bitcoin. And people's attachment to the US dollar is still very, very strong. Like it might be a generational thing before that actually ends, I think. And I mean, Larry will have some really interesting opinions on that as to why or why not the US dollar can maintain itself. But what I can comment on is from an external perspective, Hong Kongers and Chinese people still really love the US dollar. And I think this is part of the reason why Tether is so widely used.
Interesting. That's super interesting and super insightful, because you see, this is that kind of things that are not covered at all. Obviously, if you are way deep into it and you made articles and you have been on the ground, you can share all these things. But yeah, it's super fascinating. I think it's a whole rabbit hole. I have more questions about it, but I also want to cover a lot of things. So probably we'll do a second part another day, because I want to also cover. You have been in El Salvador, so I also want to ask you about that.
And then you had the question from SAS mining or something too, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're gonna do right now. So guys, you know how's the thing? We have a trivia game that my previous guest have a question for my next guest. So Kent, he's from SAS Mining, has a question for you, and of course you'll have the opportunity to make a question for Leopard. So I think you'll have. This is the first time that I'm saying who's my next guest.
My question is, especially somebody that's been in the ecosystem as long as you have, what's a question you would like to answer that you rarely asked?
That I rarely get asked, I'm assuming. Yeah, it's a good one. I wish more people asked me about kind of how I think about Bitcoin's evolution. I tend to get asked a lot of questions about like the presence of Bitcoin, and like kind of what's happened with Bitcoin in China. But I feel like, not a lot of people ask me, what is it that, the people you talk to and like different repressive contexts, what do they need out of Bitcoin? Right. The other thing I guess like that most people don't realize is, even though we're on the show and we're talking about Bitcoin in China, obviously I wrote a book about it. I've also written about a lot of different governments, Bangladesh, and just internet censorship overall. So yeah, I'd probably ask myself a question about like, if I were to phrase it, it would be like, how do you think the future of surveillance tech, what can Bitcoin do to like really fight that, right? Or what can we do as Bitcoiners to really fight that? That's what I.
What is the question? And what is the question about it?
What?
You delivered the answer. The question. What is the answer?
Oh, what is the answer?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh man, how long do you want to go? But okay. Well, let me, because I do want to cover a little bit of like my experience in El Salvador as well.
Yeah.
So, and then I also want a question for Larry. So Okay, so brief answer to that is I think that
the brief question.
yeah. I think Bitcoiners should listen to a lot of different communities, and really understand the different use cases. I just feel like we live in very different universes in different Bitcoin communities. People who are using it are not the ones who actually tend to go to the events. So there's a very different ecosystem. So just bridging that, I think, is really important. And then, all the other things that follow. I mean, I don't know, activate LPCTV and all this other stuff. So that's my answer to that.
All right, so we're going to start wrap it up, and the best way to do it is to ask you about El Salvador. So you have been there, of course, to adopting Bitcoin. But besides that, I also want to know your insights in general about the country. I will leave blank space to you if you want to talk about it, like your personal experience about there, or if you want to talk a little bit about what you think about the Bitcoin experiment, let's say, that people say in El Salvador. Of course, there have been some changes with all the IMF loans. I'm going to be honest, I don't like to talk about the IMF loans for now, because I think nobody has the answer except Bukele or the Bitcoin office or the IMF, and everything else is just noise. So people can give their opinion if they want to, but I think the right answer will have it. The truth will have it. Well, the two parts will have it: the IMF and of course Bukele and the Bitcoin office. But they're not talking now, so. Yeah, so that's why for me it's not right. But going back to El Salvador, if you can share a little bit about your insights, and also, I'm gonna put it right now because otherwise I will forget. Of course, you have noticed that El Salvador have had relationship with China, right? They deliver us the Binais, that is the library.
Yeah.
It's super awesome. Of course, I think it's going to be a stadium. I don't know if they're doing it.
Stadium,
right now.
water as well. Yeah. Waterworks.
The water as well. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think Bukele is playing a really, complex 4D chess game because he also have relationship with the US, with China, with Russia, with everyone. So he doesn't have enemies, but he's a smart guy. So he have like a very complex, I think, in general, the relationship with everyone. But yeah, first let's start with your experience there.
Yeah. Well, so I came to. So first of all, like I don't really have like any special insight, into El Salvador. I would say so. I'm just kind of taking it more as like a layperson observer. I did write an article about El Salvador's monetary history for Forbes. That was back when they were adopting the legal tender law. Just because I was also just interested in how it all came together, and it was interesting seeing it on the ground. El Salvador being basically a dollarized economy, right? And then also, having quite a bit of Bitcoin adoption. So let's start there. I thought I had a lot of fun in El Salvador. Like I thought it was a great experience. I mean, it helped a lot that it was during adopting, but also got to meet like a bunch of different people, including what I would say are, I guess, Bitcoin refugees, or I don't know, like people who left other countries and they're coming to El Salvador. So yeah, generally like the community is rad. Like that, like much love to all the people, going to the MPB office and just seeing like people out there going to educate.
The grassroots efforts.
Yeah, like the very grassroots parts, and so I do speak enough survival Spanish to actually kind of play that game of like I tend to ask the Uber drivers, or they actually ask me sometimes because they're like, "De donde eres?" and like whatever, and then it just kind of goes on and on. And so my observations were like, first of all, like El Salvador has a really healthy P2P and economy, which I find really good. I was added to like a few of the peer-to-peer trading groups, and I'm jealous because there's like volume, right? So I'm always looking at like, oh, there's people selling and buying, and other communities around the world. I actually happen to be in one where there is quite a bit of volume, but even then, it's like I'm always struggling to find like sellers, and so like El Salvador seems to be like really well set up for like a peer-to-peer trading. This community seems really healthy and vibrant. There are different events and there are different merchants set up. There like seem to be many circular economies. I was told that approximately 8 to 10% of merchants accept, I think, or something like that.
Bitcoin,
yeah, something like that. When I go to a new city, I kind of take a look at BTC Map. And I'm always looking around, seeing like, if there are merchants that accept Bitcoin. And I would say that in San Salvador, I stayed there for like about a week and a half. And there was nothing I couldn't do that required me to trade my Bitcoin in for US dollars. Basically, even though, we say 8 to 10%, but there was like a massage therapist that took Bitcoin. There was like, dry cleaner that took Bitcoin, so all the different kind of spectrum of services. Now, it's not like to that point of 8 to 10%. It's not like everywhere. And, but I definitely think El Salvador is the place where there was the most that I've been around. And the thing that was most promising to me is even when you talk to people, because I went to the, I forget what it's called, but it's like it's kind of like a tourist trap, I guess. But like the big marketplace that sells like all the magnets and stuff, and like, yeah. So you talk to all the vendors, and some of the vendors are like, oh, I take Bitcoin, but it's through Chivo and all this, but they're really proud of it. And then at least everybody like, no. So sometimes I go out to like random people like, for example, I was in Boston recently for the MIT Bitcoin Expo, and I just asked people like, do you take Bitcoin? Is Bitcoin a thing for you? And people would just be like, what are you talking about? But in El Salvador, people were genuinely like, they were like, even if the ones who didn't take it, they were like, oh, but like we understand that, and we're looking forward to it, and they associate a lot with Bukele. Yeah. Bukele, I mean, I honestly, having gone on, because I was asking a lot of different people about this, and I think the Salvadorian people have a very positive opinion of him. That was my impression. Like the Uber drivers, everyone was talking about how safe it was. So definitely the safety part. Now, I did also have some other conversations. People were talking more about the long-term politics. I don't really know a ton about that, so I won't go like off the ship on that. But I think it seems like a fairly evident trade-off in my opinion. And where you are in that trade-off, I mean, I have my own personal opinion about that. But like, for example, if you favor safety, right, then definitely what Bukele has done has meaningfully impacted people's lives. Like that was the first thing people led with. In terms of, you mentioned Binias. I always go to every library of every place I go to. So, one of my friends actually sent me, like a screenshot, and Binias has copies of Xi Jinping Thought.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you get a huge grant, you gotta, pay the bills a little bit. Yeah. I took a photo in front of the Chinese flag. Good, funny little. But, strategically, okay, look, I also won't pretend to be like the guy who plays like 8D chess or something like that. But what I will say about Bukele is, that I think, he is managed a role that is very difficult to pull off. Namely, that he seemingly has both now the United States and China supporting his country. Now, whether that's forever or whatever, I don't know, but that seems to be the case. Like, it seems to be the case with what's happened. I'm not a huge fan of, this is just my personal opinion, people getting deported into foreign prisons, but that's like my own stance of things. But what I want to say is, from like a statecraft perspective, like what Bukele is doing is manifestly great for El Salvador. Like, if I was the leader of El Salvador and I only wanted to advance the interests of El Salvador, what he's pulling off is like actually kind of dumbfounding in a way. Like he's kind of playing there's a tricky balance with the US and China, right? Like if you take too much from one side, you take too much from the other side. It seems like Bukele is playing that game. So that's kind of like what I would say about that from like a further out lens. You see signs of this everywhere. I think I actually read, that was my one pet peeve. So I said a lot of positive things. So let me say like one pet peeve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love the what's the food that everyone, the
pupusas?
Pupusas. Yeah, I love the pupusas there. That's one more positive thing. It's just one thing you notice is that, these things aren't costless. Like, of course there are trade-offs. So just like we mentioned how Binias, is funded by the Chinese state, right? As well as, I think we're talking about like the stadium, and they're giving a bunch of these different grants and stuff like that, right? So I always noticed, and I actually wrote about it in the book. I'm like, Bukele's playing it smart, but if you read his tweets in Spanish, they're much more pro-China. And if you read his tweets in English, they're much more pro-Bitcoin. That was the impression I got.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
I think that's smart. That makes sense. The one pet peeve I had with that, and I think that's one of the consequences, is that Binias has like 5 or 10 copies of Xi Jinping Thought, and like not any Bitcoin books, or didn't have until
now.
Until now. Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, after I left, that was like the one thing I was like, it would be super rad if I had a copy of Would Mao Hold Bitcoin. I'm biased, but this is probably banned in mainland China, and then put it, with the Xi Jinping Thought. So we had a good laugh about that, because I had a friend who actually specifically went to the library and was like counting the copies of Xi Jinping Thought that they had. But you know what? I was a little bit like, it's a trade-off. I kind of get it from that perspective. It's like, if someone's going to pay the bills for you, then you gotta pay the piper as well.
Yeah, just a quick update, guys. If you're watching this today, let me tell you that in Binance now we have a lot of Bitcoin books thanks to the No Nation project that they have been. It's a small project where they installed a node in the Binance, and now we have a Bitcoin node there. It's a star node. And we have a lot of Bitcoin books thanks to donations from a lot of people. So yeah, now we have it. So
yeah, that was really cool to see. I think that was like community driven, right? I think
exactly.
Yeah. But
because I think I don't remember. It was a BitCorner that
I thought it was
told
the
what's the
Miss
name?
El Salvador or whatever.
No. It was actually it's a Canadian and I think Chinese girl that is also Salvadorian. I don't remember, but she's which name you said?
Vivian? I don't know.
I don't remember her name right now.
Whoever it is, whoever it is, that's great. By the way, that there's a node in Binias and there's Bitcoin books and I think that was when I was there. And yeah, and to be clear, like I know that's changed.
Sophia Givers is one.
Oh, great stuff. I love that came from the community. But yeah, that was the one thing because I go to libraries a lot, and a lot of libraries are very biased against Bitcoin. And so if you go to, for example, Canadian libraries or American libraries, they'll have many anti-Bitcoin books. They'll have like Attack of the Blockchain and like all this other stuff. And I'm like,
really?
Yeah, like I feel like because I go to a lot of these like used bookstores and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like for example, I was in Boston. I went to the MIT kind of bookstore, the Co-op, and then there's also another one, the MIT. I think it's the MIT Press bookstore. And if you just look at the books that they have and they shelve, you're just like, huh. Like it's very obvious to me that there's a certain bias in just the way they do things. So I'm pretty sensitive to that. So wherever I go, I always try to find I'm always like, hey, like you guys should stock my book. But obviously it's like, it's like a way to get out there. So I feel like I'm particularly sensitive to that, but that
your book should be and be nice as well.
Huh?
Your book should be and be nice.
Or should be, or I would love to put it in the same section as Xi Jinping thought, so you can kind of have like both kind of together.
I'll give the idea to Pupusas, that is the nickname of this guy from No Nation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm down. I mean, I think it would be, yeah. And look, like I don't, if you're like a country like El Salvador and you're trying to play this balance between like China and the States, like I totally get it, in that sense, right? But yeah.
That's the thing that I think that Bukele, because we're ending now, but the thing is that for a little bit of context for people that is not from El Salvador, so we had that before Bukele, our party was from the lefties, and before that we had the right party, right? So when it was the right party, it was all about US. And it was when the lefties, it was all relationship with Venezuela and China. But Bukele had managed, right? That's why I told you that I think he's playing a smart game with a 4D chess game, because he's with both, making relationship with both, because before it was like black or white, but it was like you end a relationship with one and is the enemy, and then, or the backward, right? So you go to the other one is the enemy. So yeah.
Ultimately, for me, this is like the one thing I'll say about that. To me, we are all united as peoples, not in like a communist happy sense, but like the not the enemy, but like our oppressor tends to be our states. Like a Chinese person has more in common with the American person than they realize. I mean, that I think is something that people should think about too. So ultimately, that's, But, when it comes to these games between politicians, like, it's all...
Yeah, the thing is that it's just political games.
Just political games. And so, so it's not that, I thought the funniest was Malay. Malay, like, was like, oh yeah, we got it, like, China is, like, the enemy. He's talked a really big game. And then he's like, wait, 70% of our beef exports go to China. So now it's like, well, you have to trade even like, it's like pre-campaign, China's jackals. And now it's like, well, we have to be pragmatic about our trading relationships. So, solid game sometimes.
Anyways, Roger, I wish I had more time because I have more questions to ask you, but thank you very much for your time. Hopefully I will have you for a second part in the podcast, and hope to meet you and to meet you soon in one of the mini conference. And good luck with
the book. I mean, hopefully I'll see you at the conference. And Juan, really appreciate the invite. Really appreciate the discussion we have. I don't really know what's happening with El Salvador on the ground these days. So if you like are sharing in other places or stuff, like feel free to send it to me, because love to get your perspective and other Salvadorian perspectives out there as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much for your time, guys. Don't miss this episode. Any question that you have, we're gonna share it as usual. In every podcast platform, also on YouTube and Rumble, on X. You can leave under comments if you have any more questions. One thing that I wanted to talk to you, it was about the tariff, but we have some questions prepared for Larry, so we will talk about that in the next episode, guys.
I'm sure Larry will be able to comment on tariffs. Yeah. Absolutely. Or any one of those macro people.
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, don't miss this episode and the next one. And yeah, see you next week. Ciao.